If you spend time reading online discussions about South African history, you will eventually run into internet commentators fiercely defending the legacy of the Boers. And frequently, the most aggressive gatekeepers operating in these forums post under a very specific pseudonym, Piet Potlood. These users borrow their name from a celebrated historical legend. During the Anglo-Boer War, Piet Potlood, which roughly translates to Pete Pencil, a nod to his scrawny frame, was supposedly a brilliant underdog master spy operating in the town of Potchefstroom. According to the local lore, he didn't fight with heavy artillery or cavalry charges. Instead, he outsmarted the British military using wildly unconventional tactics, harassing platoons with strings of firecrackers, a small herd of oxen, and a stubborn mule. But there is a slight problem with the legend. You won't find his name in any military archives, on any draft lists, or carved into any gravestones.
Piet Potlood never existed. He is entirely made up. The scrawny master spy is actually the fictional protagonist of a novel published in 1948. Curious, which raises a rather bizarre question. How does a character from a mid-century fiction book bypass an entire nation's critical filters and accidentally overwrite official historical memory? To understand the deception, we have to look at the author of the 1948 novel, Oswald Pirow. Pirow wasn't a career novelist. He was a highly successful King's Counsel and a prominent cabinet minister whose political trajectory had spectacularly collapsed. His career derailed for two main reasons. First, he held deeply controversial extremist sympathies. Second, as Minister of Defense in the 1930s, he became a public laughingstock when he proposed defending the country using militarized, ox-drawn bush carts. By 1948, Pirow was politically exiled and desperate to re-engage with the public, so he sat down and wrote the novel Piet Potlood. He built the deception completely by accident, using a technique we can call peppered reality. Having grown up in Potchefstroom, Pirow knew the town intimately, and he anchored his fictional spy to that highly accurate local geography. He placed his completely fabricated boy next to the actual Moy River. He mapped out specific, real-world streets. He even populated the background of the story with real 19th-century residents whose descendants still lived in the area. By wrapping a lie inside hyper-local truths, Pirow slipped past the defenses of his readers. People recognized their own backyards in the text, so they naturally assumed the boy standing in them was real too. The second accidental trick Pirow pulled was subverting the expected hero archetype. The actual historical Boer commandos were highly recognizable. They were rugged, deeply serious, heavily armed men who spent months surviving on the open veldt. Piet Potlood was the exact opposite. He was scrawny, looked half-witted, and fought with fireworks. This triggered a strange psychological blind spot. Because Piet looked nothing like a traditional, manufactured mythological hero, readers assumed his story was simply too bizarre to be faked. Then the literary academics got hold of the book, and the myth hardened into fact. In major reviews of Afrikaans literature, historians consistently categorized Pirow's novel in chapters dedicated to folklore rather than popular fiction. This academic misclassification acted as a stamp of approval. Combined with Pirow's realistic writing style, it spawned a massive, widespread rumor that the book wasn't a novel at all, but a direct transcription of a missing Boer War diary. For Pirow, the novel offered a very specific personal vindication. He had been mercilessly mocked in Parliament for his ox-drawn bushcarts. In his novel, a lone boy uses oxen to outmaneuver the British Empire. He used fiction to prove his ridiculed ideas right. The result was an ironclad myth. An unconventional character design, sloppy academic filing, and an author's bruised ego perfectly aligned to invent a historical figure out of thin air. The final reason Piet Potlood survived into the modern era is that post-1948 South Africa provided the perfect soil for him to grow. The political climate was dominated by rising ethno-nationalism, heavily fixated on the trauma and the massive numerical mismatch of the Anglo-Boer War. The culture operated on a philosophy known as 'n boer maak 'n plan, a farmer makes a plan. There was an intense societal demand for stories of underdogs surviving against massive imperial forces through sheer, scrappy resourcefulness.
Piet Potlood filled that void flawlessly. He provided exactly the mythological figure the public required to validate their historical identity. He was the ultimate embodiment of making a plan. Now, the internet has closed the loop. Modern forum users, seeing the name celebrated in local folklore, adopt Piet Potlood as a pseudonym to defend their version of Boer history online. These digital gatekeepers unknowingly create a trap. New researchers browse the comment sections, encounter a user named Piet Potlood aggressively citing history, and assume the pseudonym belongs to a real, protected legacy. This feedback loop makes the myth self-sustaining. The lack of archival evidence doesn't matter, because the sheer repetition overwrites the physical historical record. Piet Potlood became real because he was a functional truth. Oswald Piro's greatest political victory wasn't won in Parliament. He engineered a ghost that fit a cultural void so perfectly, the public simply couldn't afford for him to be fake.